I was born in 1901. My next birthday, I'll be 72 years old. But to this day, I spend many hours in the run of a year out in the woods by myself. Of all the trees, the hard maple is my favorite. It has more pictures than any other tree that I know. And unlike other hard trees, it bears its harvest in the wintertime, at the end of the snows when the tree is barren and there's frost in the ground. As long as I can remember, we have made maple syrup and maple sugar from these trees. Now I'm going to tell you about making maple syrup and maple sugar. The first thing to do is to cut your spiles, which is a small lead that brings water from the tree to the vessel. And for making this, I prefer a 3-year-old sassafras, which you cut in the right lengths, shape them up with a sharp knife, and burn all of the end out with a hot wire. The maple business, as my grandfather brought it to this country in the early 1800s. Grandfather went in that virgin forest and he tapped as many as 1,100 trees. And he was a farmer and cleared the land, had a mill and the maple business. I was raised on a large farm 7 miles west of Murphysboro in the Kincaid Bottoms. And they were large families, 6 children and my dad and my mother. We had many chores to do. I'll say this, nobody said, now that's her job or that's his job. We all worked till it was done. There was no fussing about who done what. When we worked, we worked. When we played, we played. We were a happy family. I've often said, the man goes out here and he taps the trees, and he sets his vessels, and he prepares his kettles. But the man has no say-so about the production. Nature and traits of the maple tree and the weather, that rules your whole harvest. You tap, you put it out there, and you do everything right. But nature takes over there. In tapping maple trees, you simply go out into the woods with a load of vessels and spiles and hammer and brace and bit, and there's where your tapping starts from. Then you tap, you drill into this tree some 1.5 to 2 inches deep. And in tapping, you tap on one side of your tree, however you see fit, and you tap with a little slant so the water will come right on down your spigot or spile into the bucket. I have a natural love for the woods. When I was a small boy in the early 1900s, there were a few parcels of virgin timber. Not many, but a few parcels of virgin timber. That virgin timber was the most beautiful thing. When those large trees towered out there, 40, 50, 55 feet to a limb, and just so slick and pretty it looked like a squirrel would fall off of one if he tried to climb it. Words won't describe it. Well, that provided shelter for the wildlife. And above everything else that I really loved to hear was the great horn owl. He was a character. He would sit back in one of them holes in the dark all day, and he'd let out a squall, who are you? And at a far distance, you'd hear another answer, who are you? I loved to hear that owl holler. To say he was a little dandy. In tapping these trees, it runs through the minds of many people. Does it injure the tree? I will say no, that it doesn't injure the tree, because you only drill in 1.5 or 2 inches, and a good healthy tree will heal up in 2 or 3 years till it'll only be a little scar in the bark. The best time for making and producing is when we're having warm days and cold nights, when we get a light freeze every night. When it warms up in the morning, 9, 10 o'clock, then they'll produce good maybe till midnight that night. Then after you have tapped and your trees are producing, in a few hours' time, some 8, 12, 24 hours, then the gathering starts. The gathering goes on for about 1 month. And during this month, from 15th of February till the 15th of March, which is our season here in this part of the country, there'll be closed down periods. The weather will maybe shut those trees off for 5 days. But when the weather's right, then they'll start producing again. The biggest job about making maple syrup is gathering in the water out of the woods. The early settlers had cattle teams to transfer the water from the woods. In the later days, we had horses, which that takes the strain off of maple syrup making. My father was a lover of good horses. They had to be good or they couldn't stay in our barn. Oh. No tractor, no trucks. They were your power at that time. We used horses for everything. They were like the man on the farm. They never run out of a job. One of the wonderful parts about farming was during the threshing season when the whole neighborhood would get together. The men would come together to do the thrashing. The women in the neighborhood would get together to do the cooking and enjoy every minute of it. We look forward. We look forward to thrashing season because everybody, they get reacquainted again, you know. They come closer together during thrashing season. And we had every kind of fellowship there was back in that time. In the farming, at off season, we would go to the woods and haul logs and make lumber. And when they cleared the land, cattle was the main power for logging. Cattle could climb steeper banks, and they could actually get down on their knees and pull. Horses and cattle were used on the farm as a beast of burden. Of course, we haven't got the horsepower and the oxen like they used to have, so we just bring it up with, the way I've got of expressing it, the main strength and awkwardness would tote it in. In boiling down maple syrup, the first thing is to get a good fire going. And on these cold, frosty mornings, when the sun comes up red in the east and a cold south wind, that fire feels awful good. It feels awful good. Cooking down maple water is simply evaporating the water out of the sugar. The steam or evaporation, that floats away in the air, but the sugar remains in the kettle. 40 gallons of that water will make 1 gallon of syrup. Then you have to transfer the water from your storage barrels into the kettle and fill them full, which ordinarily takes about 1 barrel of water. If we only had 1 barrel of water, it would only take about 3 hours. But when you have got 8 barrels of water, which we have had many times, well, that is a hard day's cooking. So in order to evaporate this water into syrup, it takes lots of cooking. I'll tell you how a man get an 8th grade education in 10 years. The reason I am so smart, when I went to school in the old one-room schoolhouse, down on the south side, halfway down, there was a piece of quarter round missing and that on the floor. And the mice had chewed a hole up through there. Well, in the bad weather, most of the children would sit there in the schoolhouse during the noon hour and eat their lunch, spill crumbs on the floor. 1 o'clock when school took up, I always managed to sit close to that mouse hole. Well, when everybody got still, you'd see him stick his head and shoulders out. And then back he'd go. And directly he would run out a little piece, and back he'd go. And eventually he'd get a little too far out, and I'd get busy studying and slip my foot over that hole till he couldn't get through. Directly he'd take out across over on the north side where the girls was at. Well, there'd be about 16 of them get up on their desk, and they'd holler and squall and go on, and such commotion. I'd put my book down and I'd watch them. But when they got to making it too tight for him, I'd get my foot under the desk where it belonged, and then when he made the last run for that hole, why, his old tail would just pop when he went in it. Couldn't afford to let them kill him. The fun would all been over. When your fire is hot and really working good, it's maybe having tendency to jump that water plumb out of the kettle. If it goes getting out, stir it down, or you can raise it up in the air and pour back. The one that's cooking, they have to watch not to waste what they've already worked for. Another time I left Mount Joy School Ground under tight hat. It was during the war, World War I, when Kaiser Wilhelm was the ruler over Germany. Well, you all know that he was our #1 enemy at that time. They had hired a young married woman for a teacher, and she's very patriotic. And the first thing was to do of a morning when 9 o'clock come, school took up, sing the Star Spangled Banner. Well, the Star Spangled Banner never was, in my notion, too easy a song sung and do a good job. So one morning she's up there in an old-fashioned organ, and she was sitting on that stool, and she was really pawing them pumps, and toot, 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 that old organ was a-going. According to her story, we wasn't doing too good a job of singing. And she twisted around on that stool, and she shook her finger at us, said, "There ain't a patriotic kid in the schoolhouse. You're nothing but a bunch of slackers." Said, Kaiser Wilhelm could do as good a job of singing as Jones is doing. Well, she done said too much then. I said yes, and Kaiser Wilhelm could come as near a playing it as you do. Then they didn't have a whisk, they had clubs. They had a club for 6 guys and myself. She grabbed one of them clubs, and here she come. And I thought, well, now it's a poor set of legs that can't take care of a body. And I run like a rabbit. Well, in the meantime, they shut down the school on account of the flu, and that was my last day of school. In boiling down, when it comes to finishing, you must watch. In case of letting it go too far and ruining it, and when you get it down to a point where it's about ready, you can tell very well by looking at it when it's close. But then right on the final touch, take a metal pan and you dip through that hot syrup and you raise it up, pour it out, back into the kettle, but hold it some 2 foot above the kettle where the air can hit it. If it drips free and clean from your metal pan, it's still water in it. It's not ready. But when it's just coming around to where it's ready to take up, when that last few drops comes out of there, it'll wax. It'll wax across the edge of your pan, and when that air hits it, when it does that, then it's ready to go through a cheesecloth into a milk can or whatever container you're going to keep it in. At the end of a long, hard day, from daylight to dark, it has boiled down to this: a milk can of beautiful golden brown maple syrup. After we have let the syrup set for a couple of days, and after your syrup is cleared, if you want sugar, you go on down. About 11 pounds of syrup will make 7 pounds of sugar. In other words, you take another 4 pounds of water out of that syrup to make the sugar. Clarifying is taking the dirt out of the syrup. And that is done by using the white of an egg whipped to a foam and spread over the cold syrup and let the syrup come to a slow boil. And the syrup will boil through that foam, and then it will gather these particles. You skim them off carefully then, and throw that in the waste, and that is it. You hold it between you and the light. If it's been cleared right, there won't be a thing floating around in there. It'll be just clear as vinegar. I'm going to tell you, back when I was a boy, how happy people was and how poor they were. I knew in one case where there's two families lived over here on Big Kincaid. They had a large family of children, and they were quite musicians. They'd take their fiddles and their banjos and their guitars and French harps, and they'd go to some of the more prosperous farmers' house through the winter months, and they'd want to entertain. And they'd fiddle, and they'd sing, and they'd dance, and they'd have a big time till midnight. And they'd get ready to go home. They'd say, "Uncle Louie," this was one of the men, "would you let us have a peck of cornmeal and a gallon of molasses so we'd have something to eat tomorrow?" Now the part that buffaloed me was, how could you go and fiddle and dance and sing till midnight and not a bite in the home to eat for the next day? But it was just that way. In making sugar, after it once comes to a boil, you've got to be very cautious with a low fire. If you didn't watch it and it boiled over on the stove, created a big smoke in the kitchen, and then Mother was out of humor. So that way you had to just keep a constant watch on your sugar making. You could mold it in anything, but in order to keep that from sticking, grease your container real good with butter. I might tell you this. When my father used to make the maple sugar, he'd watch it and he'd test it. And he'd say, "Come on now, get in on this because I've got to do something with it." Well, then we went for our last spoonful of wax. But that was something to eat. To get your sugar, you just keep boiling the syrup down to a stage. And the way you test that is by pouring a spoonful of hot syrup into a cup of cold water. If it's ready for sugar, it'll wax. And you can fish it out with a table fork, and it'll hardly stain your water. In making your maple sugar, when it is ready to be poured into the mold, why, it is well to take the container with the syrup in it in one hand and a large spoon in the other and whip it fast and hard. That will cause that to kind of foam up just a little, and it grains. It's more apt to sugar just right without it being a waxy nature. We have undoubtedly lost something, because you see these people out here on these tractors working with machinery. They do 20 times as much work in a day than we done. But when we had that slow operation and working with those horses, you could hear people singing in the field for miles. Some whistle, some sing. And now then, I believe you could go from New York to California and never hear a person singing in the field. Old Dan Tucker's a very fine man. He washed his face in the frying pan. He combed his head with a wagon wheel, and he died with toothache in his heel. Well, that was it. Maple syrup, sugar, and the wax, just before it's sugar, is out of this world when it comes to eating. There's not just many things like it. I never did wish to live my life over, but if I was to live it over, I believe I'd choose to go back. Old Dan Tucker's a very fine man. He washed his face in the frying pan. He combed his head with a wagon wheel, and he died with toothache in his heel.